I don't know if you can read this caption, but it says, well, here comes Mr. Hunter and Gatherer with another useless treasure. Like this ancient hunter and gatherer, our world is one that's come to be dominated by possessions. For most of us, possessions provide us with a source of comfort and convenience and even pleasure. But if we were to lose the ability to judge the true value these possessions have in our lives, they can become a living hell. And that's just what's happened for people who suffer from compulsive hoarding or hoarding disorder. Now, the most famous case of hoarding occurred in the 1940s, the Collier Brothers. How many of you have heard of the Collier Brothers? Almost everyone. 1947, the police got a telephone call that there was a dead body in the Collier mansion at 2078 Fifth Avenue in Harlem. This is a picture of the building here. And the police came and they decided that this threat was credible enough that they needed to get into the house. But all of the windows were blockaded, and the doors were blockaded, and they couldn't get in. And finally, in order to get in, they had to order a fire truck with a fire ladder, and they could get in one of the, you can see the fellow just entering the window here. That's the only way they could get into the building. And what they found inside was a home absolutely packed with stuff. There was only about 2 feet from the top of the stuff to the ceiling, right where the window was. The room the officer got into opened up there into an opening, and there he found the body of Homer Collier. Homer was one of a pair of brothers who lived in the house. They were in their 60s, early 70s, and they lived there for many years. They were the sons of one of the more prominent families in New York. Their grandfather owned one of the big shipping companies in New York City. Another grandfather ran a container system on the river. So they were families were quite wealthy. They were sort of the upper crust of New York establishment. Both the brothers went to Columbia University. Homer was Phi Beta Kappa, became an admiralty lawyer, although he didn't work very much. Langley, his brother, studied engineering. He never worked as an engineer, at least not professionally, although you'll see some of his engineering work here in the building. He was also a concert pianist and debuted in Carnegie Hall. But he was on the same docket as Paderewski, and Paderewski got a better review, so Langley never played publicly again. He played for his brother, however. Now, what happened then was that this hit the newspaper. Homer Collier was found dead, and now they're looking for Langley because they can't find him. And the hunt for Langley, I don't know if you remember much about the story of the Collier Brothers, but for 3 weeks in New York City, this was the stuff of all the newspapers. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was hunting for Langley. At one point, the search got so desperate that they stopped a subway line before it got to the station because someone had reported a Langley Collier sighting on the subway car. So it got pretty intense. The house itself was absolutely packed with stuff: newspapers, magazines, books, stoves, cars, horse-drawn buggies, boats, and even a 2-headed fetus. The boy's father was an OBGYN surgeon, and so he kept specimens sometimes, and one of the specimens he kept was of a 2-headed fetus, and that was still in the house. Langley was still missing. As I said, he was a former concert pianist. This is a picture of Langley Collier in his later years. One of the things that Langley did in the home was to create tunnels. And you can see here the opening to one of the tunnels he created. Because the rooms are full almost all the way to the ceiling, there was no way to get around inside the house. In fact, they never could quite figure out how the brothers got in and out of the house, because there was no apparent opening. They did find this series of the labyrinth of tunnels. Some of the tunnels were a little bit like mole holes, where the tunnel ended, but if you got to the end and you took the stuff in front of you and put it behind you, then you could continue. So it's quite an elaborate thing, and some of the tunnels were booby-trapped. So you can see here, the stuff up on top here is sort of dangling precariously there and could easily fall on you if you weren't careful. And there were tripwires and things of that sort in the mess to trap someone who tried to get in to steal something. As I said, what happened here is that this hit the newspapers, and for about 3 weeks was front page business in New York City. And you can see here the attempts to search the place, because now that the police had decided that maybe Langley is still somewhere in the house. And so they're trying to search through the house to find out where he is, and they eventually decide that really what they need to do is to take everything out of the house in order to find him. So they started, actually they started on the first floor, and then they decided, some engineers took a look and decided that if they cleared out everything on the first floor, the building wouldn't be able to sustain the weight of the upper floors. So then they moved to the upper floors, but they couldn't get in here through the windows, so they had to go up on the roof and punch a hole in the roof and go down inside and start pulling things out that way in order to clear out the building. So they did that for the course of about 3 weeks. And then what happened was they found Langley Collier's body inside the mess about 3 weeks after they found Homer's. And in fact, what they found was that he was only about 10 feet away from where they found Homer, but there was so much stuff they couldn't find it until they excavated that room. What had happened was Langley got caught in one of his own traps. And he was going through the tunnel, he hit some sort of trip device, and something collapsed on him. You can see here's a picture of the body with the stuff on top of it. And he was killed here. Now, Homer was paralyzed and blind. And so he was being taken care of by Langley. And the thinking was what happened was Langley got caught in this booby trap and died, and Homer starved to death after that, only 10 feet away, probably knowing what happened to Langley. So it's quite a dramatic story. Here's a picture of the body. It's a little gruesome, but it's sort of interesting. And then what happened was that the building really had to come down, so they tore the building down, and now it is a park. And here's a picture of myself with a couple of my students who made a pilgrimage to the Collier Brothers Park to take a look at what it's like. Interesting story, just a few years back, the Neighborhood Association in Harlem wanted to change the name of the park because they didn't think that the Collier Brothers Park really reflected well in the community. So they wanted to change it to Reading Tree Park. There are a bunch of plane trees there, the benches to read by and so forth. But the Parks Commissioner wouldn't let them. He said that the Collier Brothers is a part of New York City history and therefore should be represented somehow in the name of this park. So it remains the Collier Brothers Park. Anyone who wants to can go down. Sometimes it's locked. I'm not sure exactly when it's open and when it's locked, but it's a nice place to visit. And sort of an interesting history in New York. Okay, whoops. So, what I want to do now, let me back up for just a second here. Just to let you know that Collier Brothers was, a long time ago, the 40s, but this kind of case appears to us quite frequently. Here's an account just a year or two ago of a woman in Las Vegas. A 4-month search for the missing Las Vegas woman came to a ghastly end this week when her husband found her corpse in their home amid a labyrinth of squalor that had been impassable, even for search dogs. They've been searching for this woman for quite some time before they found her. So these kinds of cases, the Collier Brother cases, are not all that unusual. You do see them occasionally. So you do see some of these very extensive or very severe kinds of hoarding cases occasionally. If any of you have watched the hoarding TV shows, sometimes you see those as well. Although they're sort of hard to take, I think, in terms of TV viewing. Okay, so what I want to do now to sort of turn and start thinking about the nature of this behavior, I want to take you through the house of a sort of modern day person with this problem. This is the home of Irene. If you've read stuff, you'll recognize Irene was one of the main characters in the book. And I want to just note a couple of things about this, and then I'll use a lot of examples from Irene's case to talk about the nature of attachments to possessions. As you can see here, this is a fairly messy kitchen full of stuff. A couple of things to notice. There's very little horizontal surface that's free. This little corner of the table is free. This is where she and her 2 children eat their meals. Now, clearly they can't eat at the same time, so they have to eat in sequence. Everything under the table is full, under the chairs are full, the chairs are piled on top with stuff, and in order to sit on a chair, they have to move stuff off of it. Take a look, though, and this is an interesting feature, and it's one that's very important for us in trying to figure out the difference between someone with a hoarding behavior and someone who is a collector. And that is the extent to which this stuff is organized. If you look on here, what do you see? You see light bulbs, egg carton, newspapers, ribbon, more newspapers, wrapping paper, telephone books, a wide assortment of things, a seemingly random assortment of things. Okay, it's an important point here in hoarding is that this is characteristic of what we see in this disorder, in this problem. The other thing we see occasionally is what you see back here. What is this? Pile of papers, right? And what are they next to? A stove. You have a heat source and a fuel source next to each other. This is something that will drive a fire official crazy. And in fact, we know that hoarding is associated with some fire-related dangers. I was in Melbourne, Australia a few years ago. I visited the Melbourne Fire Brigade. Their request, they had just finished a 10-year study of hoarding-related behaviors in residential fires. And what they discovered was that these things don't happen very often. Only about 1/4% of all the fires in the state of Victoria in Australia had hoarding as a problem associated with the fire. But those fires accounted for 24% of the fire-related deaths. And what happens is that when you have a fuel source and a heat source close to each other, it makes fires more likely. And when you have this kind of arrangement, it makes it much harder for people to get out, as you'll see in just a few minutes here. The other thing you notice here is that these things are all piled up here along with her purse. And they are papers. There's nothing else mixed in here. These things, in Irene's eyes, are clean. Everything else in this room, in Irene's eyes, is contaminated. In addition to this hoarding problem, she has a contamination obsession and cleaning compulsions. And her cleaning compulsions are so extreme that on occasion, as I worked with Irene for quite some time, and once as we were working, we were sitting in her TV room, and an envelope from the top of the pile fell to the floor. And now that envelope moved from the clean category to the contaminated category. And so she had to stop what we were doing. She picked up the envelope, took it into the kitchen, and ran it under the faucet for a few minutes. And in that way decontaminated it, but at the same time destroyed it. So you can see that the power of these kinds of OCD behaviors. So Irene had both a hoarding problem and an OCD problem, and they were independent of one another, which is quite interesting. There's a whole other area of places where these two things converge, but in this case they were separate. This is her Irene's dining room. You can see stuff piled almost all the way to the ceiling. It's different stuff. I mean, it's mostly clothes, but we also see plates, a vase, some pieces of games, glasses, books. And you know what these things are? Lids for containers. Okay? This is very characteristic in hoarding cases. What we see is people with hoarding problems will collect the physical materials necessary for organization. These plastic bins. She purchased them in order to get organized, and here's where they end up. Okay? Very characteristic in this case. The other thing that's quite characteristic is, it's hard to see here, but there's about a 1 foot wide pathway that goes along the side of the pile and along the back of the pile there. It's very characteristic in these cases. Now, in very severe cases, those piles get filled in. But at more modest kinds of hoarding problems like this, we still see these paths, these little go paths, we call them. This is the other side of the pile looking back. We were back here before. Now we've gone along here and over here. And I show this the pile looks much the same, but I show it because this is the front door to a house. So if she's in this part of the house, and a fire starts with that stuff in the kitchen, she's not going to get out alive, because there's no way for her to get. The only place she can enter and leave the house is through the garage. The garage is a sea of stuff with a little path going into the kitchen. And so she's not going to be able to make it there if the fire starts in the kitchen. This is her TV room. There is a coffee table there. You can't quite see it. But here, she told me something really interesting. She said, you know, I sit here for 3 hours every day trying to organize my stuff. 3 hours, and it looks like this. And so I asked her if she wouldn't mind doing what she normally does and sort of talk me through what she's doing. So she sat down, she picked up an item off the top, and what she said was, it was a piece of newspaper with an ad for tire sale, automobile tire sale. She said, my car needs tires, but I don't have the money right now. And this is a good company. They have sales often. The sale's no longer going on, but I know they have good sales, so I want to keep this to remind myself. So I'm going to put it here on the pile, and she picked up the next thing, which was a brochure about a resort in Vermont. I've lived in Massachusetts all my life, but I've never been to the Northern Kingdom, she said. And when I have time and money to go, I want to look at this place as a possible place to go. So I'm going to put it here on top of the tire ad, but I'm going to twist it a little bit so I can see them both. And then she pulled up the next thing, which was a brochure on how do you talk to your kids about drugs. And she said, this is critical. My daughter's coming home from school. She's 13. I need to have this conversation with her. I've got to keep this. I'm going to put it here on top of these other things, but make sure I can see all of them. So she twists that with as well, and on and on. So what happens during those 3 hours is she churns the pile, she reviews everything, and she reminds herself why everything is important, why everything is compelling and must be kept. And that's the process she goes through in trying to dislodge herself from all this stuff. So it says something really critical about the difficulties we face here. The other thing that it tells us about is something about this organizational structure, because now it's starting to look a little funny. Before, when we started in the kitchen, the dining room, and here, it looked random. Now it's starting to look like there's some kind of pattern. And that's a critical thing for us to keep in mind, and how this differs from people with other kinds of collecting behaviors. Okay, now, one of the important things that's happened in the last month, 1 month ago, is that the American Psychiatric Association decided that hoarding should be a new disorder when DSM comes out in May. So in May, mental health professionals will be able to give a diagnosis of hoarding disorder. And these are the criteria for hoarding disorder. A persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of actual value. A couple of things are important there. This is persistent. This is something that's chronic. It's not, it's not something that happens when, you've got parents who die and leave you a bunch of stuff and then moves into your house and it's full for a while. That doesn't qualify. It's got to be a persistent problem. Discarding or parting with possessions is not just throwing stuff away. It's getting rid of stuff in any fashion, giving it away, donating it, selling it. Any of that is difficult for these folks. And it's regardless of its actual value. Early on, people used to think that hoarding consisted of people who saved, that behavior was saving worthless and worn-out things. Turns out not to be true. People with hoarding problems save everything. A lot of it, may be worthless and worn out, but they save more of worthwhile stuff as well. If you've read stuff, there are people in the book who save very expensive art, and it ends up being part of a hoard. So it's not just worthless and worn out things, it's things of all value, so it's regardless of their value, it's important. The difficulty discarding is due to perceived need to save the item, so it's not a motivational problem. It's not the fact that the person is depressed and can't get the motivation up to get rid of stuff that's piled up in their home. These are things that people really want and are intending to save. The symptoms result in possessions that congest and clutter the active living areas and substantially compromise their intended use. Originally, it was the wording was makes use of those rooms impossible. But it turns out that was too stringent. So in the last iteration of the wording of these, it was changed to being substantially compromised. Now, it is true that there are situations where there might not be any clutter and you still get the diagnosis, and that those happen if there's someone else in the person's life that's got control of that space. So a spouse may not allow the clutter in that space. Now, if there's no clutter because someone else is taking care of it, there has to be some other kind of impairment or distress. And typically in that situation, the kind of impairment we see is marital distress, marital conflict, because we see people at war with each other over control of space. And it's like a battle line that's drawn down the house. And the person, the battle line changes, it shifts back and forth depending on who's winning the battle, as it were. Okay, there are two specifiers in the DSM categorization. One is if there is excessive acquisition. Now, this is sort of interesting. This is one area where our research is focused lately, and that is how often do people with hoarding problems actually acquire things excessively? Or is it just that they let their homes fill up? And what we find is that most people with hoarding problems actively collect much more than the rest of us do. The other specifier is insight. And we won't get it too much into this, but there are a certain percentage of people who don't have much of a recognition of this as a problem. Most people with hoarding problems seem to recognize it on some level. And there are a whole bunch of issues we could get into there, but we'll leave it at that. So what we've got with a hoarding problem is three manifestations of behavior: excessive acquisition, difficulty parting with things or the intention to save things, and a problem with organization. That's what we've seen. Now when we talk about things like collecting, where we see the overlap is with collectors. We see a lot of acquisition and we see a lot of saving behavior. We tend not to see much disorganization. And we'll come back to this in a minute because I want to talk a little bit about each of these, because here's where we get into the sort of interesting features about the nature of attachments to possessions. In hoarding, we see excessive levels of buying, excessive levels of acquiring free things, and to a lesser extent, some stealing behavior. Some stealing behavior more than normal, but still only between 5 and 10% of people with hoarding problems that steal things. So it's a small number, but it's still significant. In collecting, we see a lot of buying behavior. Perhaps not as much as we see in hoarding. We don't see much collecting of free things, and we don't see stealing. It's hard to get a sense of what this buying problem is like for people, but a couple of anecdotes might help. Irene could not go to New York City because if she went to New York City, invariably she would see a news kiosk on the street. When she saw the news kiosk, what she would think to herself is, look at all those newspapers and all those magazines. Somewhere in all of that, there's a piece of information that could change my life. How can I walk away without it? And the only way she could tolerate it would be to look the other way, cross to the other side of the street, and walk by without looking at the news kiosk. And what's that behavior called? Avoidance. For those of you taking your abnormal psychology course, avoidance behavior. Anytime people engage in avoidance behavior to avoid some kind of distressing situation, it's usually a bad sign. Bad things happen when people do that. So Irene has a buying problem. About between 70 and 80% of people with hoarding problems have these kinds of buying problems. She also had a problem with acquiring free things. She had an arrangement with the local postmaster. Any newspaper or magazine that couldn't be delivered because the address was smudged, he would put it in a box, and on Saturday morning, he'd put it out in the foyer, and she would come by on her way to the tag sales. She would pick it up and bring it home. And her home was filled with newspapers and magazines collected in that way. Now, she didn't steal things, but a small number of people who have hoarding problems do. Okay. The saving part of these manifestations, typically what we see here, the nature of the items saved by people with hoarding problems tend to be things like clothes, newspapers, books, containers, and so forth. But virtually anything is possible. These are just the high volume things. We'll get to how that compares with collecting in a few minutes. The nature of the attachments, and here is a really one of the most fascinating things about this, and that is, in our first study, we asked people with hoarding problems why they saved the things they did. And we asked people who didn't have hoarding problems why they saved the things they did. The reasons were exactly the same. Exactly the same. And they fall into three different categories. The difference turns out to be the extent to which these kinds of values are placed on a wide variety of objects. Okay? Some good examples. Instrumental saving. We save things because we need them. You save your driver's license because you need it. Okay? You've got a use for it. I didn't show you Irene's kitchen, but you know the space between your refrigerator and the cupboard around it? It's packed full, hundreds of cardboard tubes from the inside of toilet paper rolls. And what she said was those would make great art projects. And I'm saving them for my son's art teacher. She never even met her son's art teacher. She didn't know whether he wanted them or not. But the thought that here is a use for this object was important to know. And it led her to another thought. And that thought was, I can imagine a use for this. If I throw it away, I will be wasting it. Now, is this a good thought or a bad thought? I mean, maybe this is something the rest of us should be thinking about. I mean, we all throw things in the landfill that may have use to other people. And as years go by, we may need to come around to this way of thinking and not waste quite so much. The difficulty for Irene is that she really couldn't get it from her place to any other place that's going to be used. So her home became like a landfill. Okay? And that happens characteristically with these folks because their homes are full with things they don't want to waste, but then they die, and their kids have to take over and handle all this stuff. And where does it end up? It ends up in the landfill. Ends up in the landfill. So instrumental saving, you can see the difference here. It's something we all save for instrumental reasons, but the difference is in how it's applied. Sentimental saving. The other part of instrumental saving, it's a little bit off to the side, but it's something that I've often thought in hoarding that maybe this is a disorder related to opportunity. Irene had this great quote. What she told me was, life is a river of opportunities. If I don't grab everything interesting, I'll lose out. Things will pass me by. The stuff I have is like a river. It flows into my house, and I try to keep it from flowing out. I want to stop it long enough to take advantage of it. Everything in her home to her represented a possibility, an opportunity, and she just couldn't let go of any of it. And by not letting go of any of it, she couldn't take advantage of it. And that's the difficulty she's got. Sentimental saving, again, we all save things for sentimental reasons, right? The ticket stub to a favorite concert you went to, okay? It's sentimental, but here is the fascinating thing about the way in which we human beings relate to our possessions. This is a form of magical thinking. It's what anthropologists call superstitious magic, and what psychologists call essentialism. This object has an essence, the essence of which goes well beyond its physical characteristics. Now, I teach a seminar at Smith on hoarding, and one day I asked the students if any of them had some object they owned that had special value for them. And one of the students sheepishly raised her hands and said that she owned a shirt once worn by Jerry Seinfeld. She bought it on eBay. If you're a Seinfeld fan, it wasn't the puffy shirt. But it was a shirt once worn by Jerry Seinfeld. So I said, okay, what makes that shirt special? And what she said was because it connects me to Jerry Seinfeld. And I said, well, how does it connect you to Jerry Seinfeld? There's nothing about Jerry Seinfeld. It's been laundered. There's no DNA left. And she said, because it was once worn by Jerry Seinfeld. And so I said, well, if you didn't know that it was worn by Jerry Seinfeld, would the shirt have the same value? And all the students said no. So I said, the value, really, it's in your head, isn't it, and not in the shirt. And they said, no, it's in the shirt. And so what this essence the shirt has, this essence goes well beyond its physical characteristics. And it's something in their minds. They know the shirt was at some point connected. In that sense, it's a form of superstitious magic. It's the basis for things like voodoo and those kinds of things. Things that were once near or touching each other have some sort of reciprocal action later on. That's the nature of the thinking. It's a primitive form of thinking. But yeah, we all do it. We all do it. But for Irene, and for people with hoarding problems, it's pretty strong. Another example of this kind of thing is, sentimental saving, is anthropomorphism. We all anthropomorphize objects, starting with our pets to, teddy bears to all kinds of things like that. But in hoarding, again, what we see is an exaggeration of this effect. Deborah, one of the other people in stuff, is a woman who can't throw much of anything out that was associated with her. When she gets a piece of junk mail, she said it feels like, and opens the junk mail, takes the stuff out. She said it feels like these things that came in the envelope are my children. They're part of me now. It was addressed to me. It's got my name on it. It's like it's alive. And I have another quote here. Let me read this to you. It's right out of stuff. It's from a woman named Paula Katakis, and she's the only person in stuff who agreed. In fact, she insisted that I use her real name. She's an advocate for hoarding-related things, and she's way out front on this. And what I asked her is if I could describe her in the book as a former hoarder. And she said no. And she said, and here's why. And she told me this story about throwing away yogurt. Here's what she said. As I tossed it into the bin, the thought crossed my mind, maybe the container would rather be dry inside instead of sitting there for a long time, humid. I resisted rescuing it in order to dry it out first. Although it felt very silly to have the thought about the yogurt container, it was not at all easy to resist. I felt anxious about letting the top stay on. I wanted to go back into the bin, take the top off, so as to ease my anxiety about making the yogurt container stay humid and thus uncomfortable. I also had to resist apologizing to the container, even as I was reminding myself that it was not alive and was simply a plastic container. And yes, this all feels very crazy to me. I remember feeling bad about not choosing this particular container as one that would remain at home with the others, and so I was feeling responsible for rejecting it and placing it into the recycling bin to begin its long journey to eventual destruction. I felt responsible for giving it as comfortable a ride as possible, seeing how I was rejecting it, and the thought of it having to endure a humid long journey made me very anxious. This was followed quickly by the thought of how silly this thinking was, and then I needed to resist following through on what I wanted to do to make me less anxious. So you see this anthropomorphism extends for people with hoarding problems a little farther than it does for most of us, because most of us probably would not anthropomorphize a plastic container, but yet we do anthropomorphize lots of other things. Okay. The other kinds of sentimental attachment we see are related to identity. And here, for all of us, our possessions are part of our extended self. There's a lot of research in anthropology and sociology on this notion of extended self, and it all centers around ownership of possessions. But in hoarding, the notion of ownership is a little bit different. But many aspects of it are the same. As I was working with Irene once, we were in the room with all the papers, and we had this strategy where there was a recycle box and a save box. And she'd pick up a piece of paper, and she had to make a decision about which one it went into. So she picked up this ATM envelope that didn't have any money in it, but on the back she'd written how she spent the money. It was about 5 years old. She took the envelope and put it in the recycle box and started to cry. And what she said was, it feels like I'm losing that day in my life. And if I throw away too much, there'll be nothing left of me. And so you see this attachment. It was a sense of identity for her. It was like her personal history was being bound up with this object, and now she was going to lose it. Now, we in our work together, we did these experiments where we had her do things she wouldn't normally do, like throwing this away, because if I wasn't there and this happened and she felt this way, she would keep it. But because I was there, she agreed to throw it away. And we went on with the task. 10 minutes later, I asked her how she felt about it, and she thought for a minute. She said, well, you know, that really wasn't such a good day. And she was able to get rid of it. Okay, now, the other piece here, the other kind of attachment that we see, and we all do it, is an intrinsic form of attachment. Things we like. Things that don't have any instrumental value, maybe no sentimental value, it's just like we like it with a picture on the wall. The difference, again, is in how often we see this. And here's where there's an interesting overlap with artistic expression. I showed up at Irene's house one day, and her eyes lit up, and she said, I've got to show you something. She went into the next room and came back with this large, clear plastic bag filled with bottle caps. And she said, look at these bottle caps, aren't they beautiful? Look at the shape and the color and the texture. And I knew I shouldn't have dropped out of art appreciation in high school. Because when I look at a bottle cap without a bottle, the only thought that occurs to me is that this is trash. But for her mind is filled with this complex array of thoughts about this object and appreciation for the physical world that most of us don't have. And this has led us to think a little bit about the overlap between the experience of hoarding and this aesthetic sensitivity, where art and hoarding collide in this appreciation for the physical world that the rest of us don't seem to have. There's a focus on the unique details of objects and an appreciation of those objects. And we see a few examples in the art world where this happens. Andy Warhol's a good example. Now, Andy Warhol was probably right on the borderline in terms of his hoarding. By the time he died, his house, his building in Manhattan, he was down to living in 2 rooms, and those rooms were really cramped. What Andy Warhol did is, for about 10 or 15 years, last 10 or 15 years of his life, every week, he took whatever was on his desk, Apple cores, checks, cash, pieces of art, and he dumped it all into a cardboard box, taped it up, labeled it, and put it away and labeled it as a time capsule. And by the time he died, there were like 700 of these things, all with the detritus of Andy Warhol's life. He never threw anything away. It was all there. And now, just a few years ago, the Andy Warhol Museum started opening these. And they started going around to different museums. So Andy Warhol's hoard has become a work of art. And it sort of shows how these things collide in a way. This aesthetic appreciation that we see in many people with hoarding problems is, I think, a kind of gift. The brains seem to work in that way. And we recently did, with a Hampshire student a year ago, did a project comparing a group of folks who were artists to a group of people who were hoarding and looking at the interface. Quite interesting what we found. The kind of aesthetic appreciation seemed to be the same. This sort of focus on details, this appreciation for the physical world. And what was missing, though, was the next step that is necessary for becoming an artist. And that's to take that appreciation, take those physical objects, and put them into something that creates a piece of art. Okay? Now, occasionally we see artists do it with trash like this. Okay? And in fact, in the book, one of the characters, Madeline, was a mother of a former student of mine, a serious hoarding problem. And in college, it really became kind of serious. And in her dorm room, this pile of stuff built up into the middle of the room until all of a sudden she looked at it and thought that it was aesthetically pleasing. and she thought each of the things sticking out represented something about her life, and now it was what she thought of as a stuff structure, and she couldn't dismantle it. And that happened routinely throughout her life. The stuff piled up, and all of a sudden, to her, it had aesthetic appeal. Now, the third feature about hoarding has to do with this disorganization. And here, we see disorganization in the clutter, in the mixture of important and unimportant things. This was brought out to me quite dramatically once when working with Irene, trying to get her to let go of a lot of stuff. And I arrived one day, and she said, I think I can throw out a whole New York Times, a big stack of them. She said, let me just shake it and make sure there's nothing there. So she shakes it. Out fell an ATM envelope with $100 in cash in it. It was not a good therapeutic moment. I wondered later whether she planted it there, but I don't think she did. So we have this mixture of unimportant and important things. The behavior is also disorganized. From the churning behavior I talked about before, and a fear of putting things out of sight. Remember, she put everything so she could see it? I didn't show you her bedroom. It looked like much of the rest of the house. The clothes were piled on top of the dresser all the way to the ceiling, but her dresser drawers were empty. And what she said was, if I can't see the clothes, I'll forget I've got them. They'll be lost to me. I won't be able to use them. So I want to keep them in sight. So this contributes to the disorganization. If we have a chance, I'll say more about that because it's quite fascinating, but I want to get through stuff. And here, the disorganization feature, this is where art and hoarding collide, and art and collecting collide as well. There's no connection in hoarding world between practical projects and this aesthetic appreciation. This aesthetic appreciation among the hoarding group that we looked at was not related to past production of any art. It's unrealistic. The planning was unrealistic in terms of time and resources. A fascinating sort of example of this is an exhibit that was on in MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York City a couple of years ago. They took over the whole mezzanine level of MoMA for an art exhibit by a Chinese artist named Song Dong, whose mother was a serious hoarder, had a serious hoarding problem. This is his mother's house. She saved everything for the last 20 years of her life. Everything. And the house, this was her house. It was absolutely packed. And Song Dong had for many years tried to get her to do something about this problem, and she wouldn't or couldn't. And so he finally said, okay, will you let me turn all of this into a work of art? And she finally said, okay. So what he did was he took everything out of his house, he took the house, brought it to New York City, put it in MoMA, and then he organized everything that was in the house. And that surrounded the house. Now the interesting thing for me, I don't know how many people really notice this, but the difference here is that if you imagine what the house was like when she owned it, all this stuff was in a completely random space inside the house, completely disorganized, and now it's all organized by row and column and type of item and so forth. Direct opposite, this focus on the disorganization versus the organization of one's possessions was striking, I thought, in this exhibit. Okay, hoarding and collecting, how do they map on to one another? That's a pretty good visual there, isn't it? In the London field trial, this was a field trial testing the DSM-5 criteria. And the folks doing it in London decided that the best comparison group was a group of people who were collectors. People who had a collection of one sort. We won't get into the definition of what collecting means, but it forms a better group to compare, to make sure in DSM that we're not pathologizing collecting and we're not pathologizing messiness somehow. And just to run through, there was near perfect sensitivity, that is detecting hoarding when it was there, and near perfect specificity, not indicating hoarding when it wasn't there. So we don't want to say someone had a hoarding disorder when they didn't. Okay, that's the specificity part. The reliability was high. Most of them met criteria, most of the hoarding group met criteria for excessive acquisition. About 30% of the collectors met definition for excessive acquisition, so a large number of them do. And most people had pretty good insight. The other, after that London field trial, there was a comparison of this group of collectors versus people with hoarding disorder. And here are the things that are really striking about the comparison here that tells us something about it. This has to do with the process people go through to acquire things. And on the one side, we have how many collectors engage in this behavior. On the other side, how many people with hoarding disorder. And what we see is that for the collectors, when they're acquiring something, they gather a lot of relevant information. 95% of them spend time gathering information. For the people with hoarding disorder, only 35% do. So their buying behavior is much more impulsive. They're planning to acquire specific objects. Very little of this group engaged in planning. Getting attached to the group, there was no difference here. They each got attached to the thing they purchased at about the same rate. Searching for specific items, a lot of searching on the part of collectors, not much by people with hoarding disorder. Feeling rewarded by the purchase, both groups said yes. Organizing collected items, 95% of the collectors organize them right away, less than half of the hoarding sample order them right away. And share collecting behaviors, that is, share the whole process and showing things to other folks after they buy it and so forth. You can see a big difference here between people with hoarding and collecting. Reasons for difficulty discarding. Useful in the future, no difference. That's one of the main reasons why people keep things, because they're useful. Sentimental attachment, interestingly, no difference. It's very similar to what we found. The reasons for saving things were much the same. Monetary value the same. Here is one that was different, avoiding waste. So people with hoarding disorder have an abhorrence of waste that we don't see in a sample of people who are collectors. And also a difference in misuse of personal information. So there's a little bit more, not quite paranoia, but a little bit more sensitivity about the nature of things. And maybe that goes along with the extent to which one's sense of identity is with this object. Because if someone else gets this object, they may misuse it in terms of personal information. And part of personal identity was about the same as well. The key differences, different features of hoarding versus collecting here. At the onset and course of the behavior, in normative collecting, we see a lot of collecting in childhood. 70 to 90% of kids have collections. About 30% of adults have collections of something. But it's intermittent, goes up and down. In hoarding begins in childhood, but it's chronic. Once it begins, it keeps getting worse and worse and worse until at some point, late middle age, it kind of plateaus and it stays pretty severe. Prevalence, again, 70% of children, 30% of adults, only somewhere between 2 and 5% of adults have hoarding disorder. Use of objects. People who are collectors spend time using their objects in one sort or another, usually in the form of a collection. They don't often use it for the purpose intended. When I was in college, I was in this dorm where you go into other people's rooms, sit down and chat. I went into this fellow's room and I picked up a comic book off a pile and I started to read it. And he walked in the room and he went ballistic. This was part of his collection. These were not to be read. And so many times with people who are collectors, it's not to use the object, but they do spend time with the object, organizing it, showing it off, and so forth. In hoarding, the stuff that gets collected almost never gets used. Almost never gets used. And maybe that's because there's so much of it that it's hard to get to each of these things. The content, the object content in collecting is very focused. The collections seem to be one category of items. In hoarding, we see very unfocused. Very seldom do we see a single category, even a small number of categories. The acquisition process in collecting is structured. In hoarding, it's very unstructured. Excessive acquisition occurs in both, but it's much more common in hoarding. Level of organization, we talked about this, very high in collecting, very low in hoarding. Distress in collecting is very rare, but in hoarding, it's very common for us to see. Social impairment is minimal in normative collecting, and it's severe in hoarding, all the way to the extent to which the frequency with which people marry. People with hoarding problems don't marry as often as people who don't have hoarding problems, and when they do marry, they don't stay married as long. Occupational impairment is rare, it's common in hoarding disorder. one of the things that it comes back to this notion of what is it that is similar to artistic expression, but in stuff described the daughter of someone with a hoarding problem, and really a quite poignant thing she told me. She said, and I'm reading this from stuff, just a brief paragraph. Ashley recently found herself in a park, admiring a tree. She noticed the contrasting hues and textures of the trunk and leaves, and she thought, I am like my mother. She's given me an appreciation of the physical world that I would not have had without her, but without the bad parts. So in some sense, what people with this disorder experience is a kind of gift. But at the same time, it's a curse. And this is what a different person and stuff told me, Deborah, who collected, she had what you might call a life editing obsession. She had to videotape every talk show on TV. So she had 8 video recorders going all the time. She never watched them, but it was something that captured the essence of the world in which she was living. Okay, so in that sense, it's kind of this extended self. And what she said, what she described as, she said, this has ruined me. She told me, I'm smart, creative, and I could have been happy, but I'm not anything. I've done nothing. I'm collecting life without living it. My only hope for making some kind of positive contribution is if my story can prevent this from happening to someone else. So while there may be aspects of this that are like a gift, there are aspects of it that are like a curse and absolutely destroy people's lives. If you're interested in information on hoarding, there is a website, the International OCD Foundation. It has become the organization for people who suffer from hoarding disorder. It's mostly an organization designed for sufferers, but its website has a hoarding center on it with a great deal of information about hoarding if you're interested in getting further information. Thank you very much.